Well, as we get started tonight, I'd like to take a look at a few Bible promises as we get going. As I look at the big mountains that surround our camp, it reminds me of some very precious Bible promises. The psalmist David, Psalm chapter 125, Psalm 125, verse 1 and verse 2. Psalm 125, verse 1 and verse 2. The psalmist declared, "They that trust in the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever." So trusting in God will strengthen us to stand as mountains, immovable. Psalm 125 verse 2 says, "As the mountains are round about Jerusalem, so the Lord is round about his people from henceforth and even forever." So as the mountains surround this camp, we can know that the Lord will be round about us as well through our meetings, through our fellowship together. One other passage that's special that has to do with mountains is Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6. Zechariah, of course, was prophesying in the time when the children of Israel came back from Babylonian captivity. And the man who was called to rebuild the city, his name was Zerubbabel. And in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, it says, "Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Who art thou, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel thou shalt become a plain, and he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shoutings, crying, Grace, grace unto it." So if tomorrow morning you get a chance and you walk outside and you look up at those pretty awesome mountains that we see outside, if you have something going on in your life that looms before you as a mountain, take courage, because God says, "I'll turn it into a plain, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts." Precious, precious promises. You know, at dinner time, some of the ladies were sharing. Thelma was talking about a experience she had with the flooding that recently occurred here in Australia. And she said if it was not for the power of prayer, she would not be here tonight. There she is, right there. Bless her heart. And Mary, I don't know if Mary is still here. I think maybe she went on to bed. But Mary was sharing that as the water started to come up towards her home, as it rose several inches, she said there were two promises that came deeply impressed upon her mind. One was Isaiah 43, verse 2, when it said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers they shall not overflow thee." And she said that verse, Isaiah 43, 2, and 1 Peter 5, 7, where it says, "Casting all your care upon him, because he cares for you." She said those two verses put her, just elevated her above all the trauma and all the stress that was going on outside. So, folk, praise God tonight. Those promises can help us do what we can't do. Will the real enemy please stand up? You know, In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus 4 times warned people, his disciples, about deception. Now you say, well, Bill, those verses, those apply to Jesus' day. So I don't know why we should be looking at those tonight. Well, they don't just apply to Jesus' day. Because when the disciples came to Christ, Jesus had just declared that the temple stones would not be laid one upon another. And the disciples thought that when the temple was destroyed and laid flat to the ground, that Jesus would come. So they applied and they believed that both events would take place at the same time. When Jesus answered their question, or their questions, he only gave one answer. And the reason why is because the events that surrounded the destruction of Jerusalem would take place just before the second coming. Now, 4 times, Christ warned us down at the end of time. Notice, Matthew 24, verse 4, Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. Okay, so there's the first time Jesus said, watch out for deception. Verse 5, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Verse 11, many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. Matthew 24:24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So Jesus, when Jesus wanted to stress something, he would always say, verily, verily, I say unto you. He would repeat the word verily twice. But here in Matthew 24, he repeats the word deceive 4 times. Christ was utterly desperate to warn his children living around the destruction of Jerusalem and those living at the end of Earth's history to watch out for deception. Now I want you to think for a minute. When you think back to, let's go even before this guy. Let's go before or during World War II. You've all read your history books and you've done some study of World War II. Who have we been told was the great enemy of the world during World War II? What was the man's name? Hitler. Hitler. That's right, it was Adolf Hitler. Now don't forget, Jesus said, take heed that no man deceive you. So we've all been told the monster of World War II was Adolf Hitler. And then after World War II, there began what we know of as a Cold War. You remember? And that took place between America and what superpower? Russia. And who was the man that headed Russia at that time? This guy right here, Joseph Stalin. And of course in America we were told and fed, well, this is the evil man in the evil empire. And so this man was painted as the world's monster after World War II. And what did Jesus say to those living down at the end of time? He said, take heed that no man deceive you. So am I telling you that we're being deceived to believe that Hitler was the monster during World War II and that Stalin was the monster after World War II? No, I'm not telling you that, but Jesus is. Of course, we heard that all the evil deeds that were taking place in the Kremlin, that this was where the fostering of the Cold War was occurring, that this was the evil empire that was destroying the world. And then, of course, I still remember this. I was about 5 years old when Nikita Khrushchev was sending Russian ships that carried atomic warheads to the little island nation of what? What was it called? Cuba. That's right, to Cuba. And of course, John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, warned Khrushchev, and he said, if those ships pass a certain point, we will have a nuclear war. And I will never forget, we had just outside the back door of our house going into our garage, we had some shelves. And I will never forget, and I was 5 years old, my dad filling those shelves with cans. And I said, Daddy, what are you doing? He said, son, things are very uncertain in our world. We're just going to make sure we have a little bit of food. So we were told again, throughout the world, the great evil, now it was Khrushchev and Russia daring to bring the world to a point of nuclear war that could have destroyed our planet. And so we were told that Khrushchev and Russia was the evil empire, and that's where evil came from. And Jesus said in Matthew 24, take heed that no man deceive you. Am I telling you that Russia was not the evil empire at that time? No, but Jesus is in Matthew 24. Here is Khrushchev on the left, and of course here is the man that brought us perestroika and glasnost in the 1980s during the time of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And this was Mikhail Gorbachev. And this was the evil empire that Ronald Reagan coined, the Soviet Union. Now it's very fascinating. Of course, when did the Berlin Wall fall? In what year was that? Does anybody remember? What was that, Michelle? All right, 1988, 1989, right in the late 1980s. The Berlin Wall fell, and that wall was a sign that communism was collapsing. And so the world rejoiced, and all of these people in Berlin were rejoicing because communism was collapsing around the world. And we thought, oh, great, this evil force has been removed. But you know, something strange was happening in the world. Prior, as the Soviet Union and communism was starting to fade and their collapse seemed to be imminent, there was another evil place in the world, and people's eyes were starting to be focused on another element in our world, that we were now being told that evil was emanating from this place. Probably some of you remember this event, the late 1970s. I believe it was in 1978, 1979, when American hostages in the U.S. Embassy in Iran were taken captive by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and now the world is starting to go through a transition. For so long, after World War II, it was Russia, the Soviet Union, the Soviets, the evil empire. And folk, that was being drilled. It was being drilled into the minds of people all over the world. But as we come into the 1970s and into the 1980s and 90s, it's starting to take a shift. And now we're being told we've got to focus on some other evil entity in the world that is rising up here at the end of time that could very well be the Antichrist. Now don't chuckle, because there's even, Seventh-day Adventist pastors and Samuel Bakioki men who taught at Andrews University that taught that Islam was a part of the Antichrist. So we're seeing a shift. And then in the 1980s, there was war that took place. And of course, this man's in the news today, isn't he? The man from Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi. And so America tees off against Gaddafi. I believe it was right around 1985 when America and Ronald Reagan went to war for a short time with Libya and Gaddafi. So the world's mind now is being shifted. The Soviet Union is starting to come down. In 1988, 89, we see the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But while the Soviets are kind of going to the background, somebody else is coming to the front. And it's Islam and terrorism. And the words of Jesus tumble down 20 centuries. Take heed that no man deceive you. Watch out, because deception will run rampant at the end of time, where you will be led to believe that all the evil is emanating from one place, when in actuality, it's coming from somewhere else. And then, of course, into the 1990s and into the years after September 11, 2001, the papers, the news media, the television, the magazines were all repeating the stories about this evil man in Iraq, the bully of Baghdad that would kill people and would stockpile weapons and was building nuclear warheads to destroy Israel and maybe even the world. And of course, his name was Saddam Hussein. And then we hear about this evil man, don't we? Osama bin Laden. Oh, what a terrorist he is. And our eyes are riveted on the Middle East, and which madman will come out of there next? Who will it be that we will be told, this is where evil is coming from? We must watch out for them. It's almost as if somebody is trying desperately to get the world to believe, here's where evil's coming from. Watch out. It's almost hypnotic as we are constantly bombarded in the press with how evil the Muslims and Islam is and how terroristic they are. And the words of Jesus ring down 20 centuries. Take heed that no man deceive you. So am I saying that Islam is a smokescreen, that Russia and the Soviet Union and Khrushchev and Stalin and Hitler and Germany, that those were all smokescreens? No, I'm not telling you that. But Jesus Christ is. When he said, take heed that no man deceive you. And so then we come to an event, catastrophic. At least 3,000 American lives were lost. People were jumping from these twin towers in New York City, September 11th, 2001. And, well, who was to blame for it? Who caused it? We've all been told who it was. And we've been told, now Baden, we haven't been told that. We've all been told it was masterminded by that evil man in the Middle East, Osama bin Laden, and that the Muslim terrorists are seeking to bring down America and the world. And now, about an hour and a half from my home up in Gainesville, Florida, there's a pastor. I believe his name is Terry Jones. Mr. Jones, a pastor, believes that God has called him to gather as many Qurans as he can find or that can be given to him, and that he has been called by God to burn them. And folk, this man does not have that large of a church. He's outside of Gainesville, Florida. It's not that big of a place. It's not like he has a cathedral that holds 10,000 people that's on, and he's on worldwide Christian stations. No, this man's just there doing his thing in northern Florida. But somehow, and for some reason, this event became known throughout the world. Now, isn't that something? Isn't that something? When I got here to New Zealand last week, a gentleman in New Zealand, when I started to mention this, he filled in the sentence. He knew exactly because he'd heard about it in New Zealand. And you could probably tell me this story just as, you're probably saying, okay, I read about that, I heard about that. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State in America, she said, oh, what this man is doing is wrong. And Benedict XVI spoke against this man. And the general of the United States Army in Afghanistan said, if this man burns the Quran, then American lives in the Middle East will be endangered. Folk, somebody is trying to tell us, and they are pulling out all the stops. Somebody desperately wants us to think that Islam is bad. That everything that takes place in this world that's evil comes from Muslim terrorists. Somebody wants us to believe that desperately. Desperately. And you say, are you saying, Bill, that there's somebody behind all of this to promote Islam and Muslim terrorists as the evil entity in the world? That's exactly what I'm saying to you. Because, see, Jesus declared, take heed that no man deceive you. This year started off with a bombing of a Coptic church, which is basically a Catholic. It's a Greek Orthodox, and the Greek Orthodox in Egypt are basically Roman Catholic. Well, there was a bombing that was done in Alexandria, Egypt, the first of this year, and guess who it was blamed on? Some Muslim terrorist extremist group. Surprise, surprise. And even amongst us as a people, Samuel Bakioki, trained at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, could dare to declare to God's professed people today. He says, in the light of this symbolic interpretation of the 3.5 years as the time of the domination and persecution of the Antichrist, during which God's people will be protected, this identifying mark of the little horn. Now, where do we read about the little horn power? Daniel 7. Daniel 7. And of course, the little horn in Daniel 7 rises up after the fall of the fourth beast, which was pagan Rome in 476 AD. And according to this man, he says this identifying mark of the little horn applies equally well to the papacy and who? Islam. Now, then he goes down, I won't read all this, but he says, the preceding analysis of the identifying marks of the prophetic Antichrist, represented in Daniel 7 by the imagery of the little horn, and in Revelation 13 by the symbol of a beast, has shown that both the papacy and Islam fulfill the qualifying marks of this prophetic power. So, according to this man, claiming to be a Seventh-day Adventist, he says, the little horn of Daniel 7 and the first beast of Revelation 13 is not only the papacy or the Antichrist, but it's also Islam. That's a very typical Jesuit trait. When you want to change the beliefs of a group of people, you take what they have always believed and you mix it with a new idea. And then over time, folk, the original idea disappears and the new idea stays. Well, I'd like to take a look for just a little bit this evening with 9/11, probably one of the most catastrophic events that has occurred in our lifetime, and ask ourselves the question, was it really Islam? No. Jesus, again, Jesus said in Matthew 24, take heed that no man deceive you. So let's find out. Here are a few questions. Why were the planes allowed to go so far off track from their original flight plan without being intercepted? You know, I asked a pilot of FedEx one day, who I got to know, and I said, Sean, you're a pilot. What would happen if you ever diverted your plane off of your flight plan, say 5 or 10 degrees? He said, Bill, I would be immediately alerted by the FAA or ground control to get back on my flight plan immediately. And he said, if I didn't get back on it immediately, at the FAA or ground control would immediately call the Air Force. And the Air Force would send up 2 fighter jets. And those fighter jets would surround my plane and they would tell me, you need to get back on your flight schedule. And I said, and what would happen if you didn't do what those Air Force jets told you to do? He said, they would shoot me out of the sky. So a question that needs to be asked, why were those planes that took off from Logan International Airport in Boston, Mass., that were going to head over the upper part of the United States, why were they allowed to divert so far off their flight plan and end up in New York City? Somebody gave orders that day to allow those planes to be diverted so far. And I guarantee you it was not a Muslim. Point 2, why did the President of the United States, George Bush, after knowing of the terror attack on the first building of the World Trade Center, continue to laugh and joke with the children in Sarasota, Florida, even though Americans were burning and jumping to their deaths? Number 3, why are we told that the airplane's gasoline and subsequent heat caused the buildings to fall when that just couldn't be? Does someone have something to hide? When I was in New Zealand last weekend, a man who works with concrete and building and construction, he came up to me after one meeting and he said, "You know, Bill," he said, "September 11th could not possibly, the buildings falling, it could not possibly have occurred because of the planes flying into those buildings." He said, "The way those buildings fell, there had to have been bombs placed at strategic locations within the building." For a student of Bible prophecy, the events of September 11, 2001 and its aftermath are deeply instructive for us today. After 9/11, or 9/11 was used to pass the Patriot Act, which seriously gutted constitutional liberty. Could something like this happen again? You know, I have people that call to order my books over the phone, and they will say, "I'd like to order some of your books about the jays." And I say to them, I say, "I didn't write any books about birds." And they'll say, "No, I meant that book, you know, that you wrote about those people, the jays." And I said, "People that are jays? I'm not sure what you're talking." I said, "You mean the books that I wrote about the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church?" They said, "Yeah, that's right." Folk, people are afraid. People are afraid. Why? Because from 9/11, the Patriot Act, if the FBI wants to listen on cell phone calls, they can do that. If somebody wants to read my email or anybody in the States, they can do that. If they want to go to your library and find out what books you pull or whatever you do at your library, they can find that out. So people are afraid, and their liberties are being ripped away from them, and the Patriot Act was part of that. Now, for a Seventh-day Adventist or somebody who is interested in Bible prophecy, when we understand that there would be an attack on the Constitution and a removal of our First Amendment rights to worship God as we choose, what happened after September 11th should be deeply instructive to us, because that was used to destroy constitutional liberty. Could that happen again? Could another attack occur to create a climate of fear whereby Sunday laws could appear absolutely necessary to a scared populace? I would take the opinion that it most certainly could. We've seen it happen 3 times in the United States within the last 20 years. We saw it at Waco. After the Waco incident, there was a great drive by a senator from Rhode Island to destroy gun laws in America, which is a serious attack on the Constitution. After Oklahoma City in 1995, when the Murrah building was bombed, some anti-terrorism laws were passed by Jesuit-trained President Bill Clinton that seriously gutted constitutional liberty in America. So 3 times, and then September 11th, 3 times in the last 20 years. Terror has been used to destroy liberty, and it could most certainly happen again.
We had similar here in Australia with the Port Arthur incident.
Okay? Ian, it's interesting. I'm not familiar with those details, but I find, Ian, I get letters from people around the world that will tell me, in your book, The Secret Terrorist, you talk about how the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order has sought to rip away liberty from Americans. And they say, we have found that the principles laid down in your books, they've happened in our country too. And you're saying it's happened in Australia. I've had letters from people in Zimbabwe. I've had letters from people in Costa Rica. I've had people in Korea who have all said the same thing. Now, from a fantastic book called The New Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin. David Ray Griffin says, in light of standard procedures for dealing with hijacked airplanes, not one of these planes should have reached its target, let alone all three of them. Skeptics about the official account believe that the attempt to crash an airliner into the World Trade Center could not have been successful under normal circumstances. The basic problem is that there are standard procedures for situations such as this, and that if that had been followed, Flight 11 would have been intercepted by fighter jets within 10 minutes of any sign that it may have been hijacked. Had the plane then failed to obey the standard signal to follow the fighter jets to an airport to land, it would have been shot down. This would have occurred by 8:24 or 8:30 at the latest. So the question of whether to shoot down a commercial airliner over the heart of New York City would not have arisen. You see, folk, the focus of all the media in the light of this catastrophic event has been the pilots who we have been told were guiding those planes, and the passports or driver's licenses or identifications that have been found at the foot of these buildings. But that's not the question at all. See, it was not a Muslim that said, go ahead and allow those planes to go off their course so drastically so they could fly into the World Trade Center. A Muslim did not give that order. What's that, Faye? That's right, Faye. That's right. So the question is, who had the authority to allow the FAA and ground control to say nothing to the Air Force and to tell the Air Force, if they got a message, do not send your jets up to intercept those planes? Now, who had the authority to do that? That's the question. That's the question. And see, what we need to remember, folk, the words of Christ in Matthew 24, take heed that no man deceive you.
That's all deception.
Who had the authority? Standard operating procedures were completely and inexplicably dropped on September 11th, something that had never occurred before. The question then remains as to who was responsible for ensuring that routine emergency response rules were not adhered to. Baikov and Israel have little doubt about who that was, saying the sabotage of routine protective systems controlled by strict hierarchies would never have been contemplated, let alone attempted, absent the involvement of the supreme U.S. military command. This includes at least U.S. President George Bush, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and the then acting head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General Richard B. Myers. Now that is quoted by Anatola Kornikov from Pravda Online, September 13, 2001. And it's quoted in David Ray Griffin's book. So these three men, George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Myers, had the authority to stop those planes from being scrambled, from sending Air Force jets up into the sky to intercept those planes. You know, when I asked this pilot one day named Sean, worked for Federal Express, when I asked him about standard operating procedures and about September 11th, he laughed. I said, Sean, why are you laughing? He said, Bill, September 11th should have never happened. It should have never happened. Kristen Breitsweiser, whose husband died in the World Trade Center, said on Phil Donahue's television show, he's a popular talk show person in America, she said, I don't understand how a plane could hit our Defense Department. Well, there's question about whether or not a plane really did hit the Defense Department. But nevertheless, an hour after the first plane hit the first tower, I don't understand how that's possible. I'm a reasonable person, but when you look at the fact that we spend $500 billion on national defense, you're telling me a plane is able to hit our Pentagon an hour after the first tower is hit? And she says there are procedures and protocols in place in this nation that are to be followed when transponders are disconnected, and they were not followed on September 11th. Now, for a lady who lost her husband in the World Trade Center, she deserves an answer. In 2005, I had a lady call me one morning. I will never forget it. She said, my name is Ellen Mariani. She said, I've read your two books, The Secret Terrorist and The Enemy Unmasked. And she said, you hit the nail on the head. I said, ma'am, who are you? She said, my husband was on one of those planes that took off from Boston Logan International Airport, September 11, 2001. She said, after it happened, she said the government offered to buy me out. She said the government offered to give me drugs. She said the government offered to give me psychiatric treatment. She said, because I simply wanted answers. What happened to my husband? And she said, Bill, I have never been given an answer. I said, Ellen, where are you now? She said, I'm in Colorado. And she said, my life is in danger. Now, these three men, George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Richard Myers, who had the authority to stop the FAA and the Air Force from intercepting those planes, they all have something in common. George Bush was a member of Skull and Bones. And anybody initiated in Skull and Bones takes a vow of obedience to the papacy and to the Black Pope in their initiation. Donald Rumsfeld is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is a front organization that was created in America around 1920 by a man named Edward Mandell House. This front organization is so behind which the Jesuit order has controlled the American press and both political parties for the last 70 years. Richard Myers is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR is a front for the insidious operations of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. According to one man who once was a part of the CFR, his name is Chester Ward, he said, This most powerful clique and these elitist groups have one objective in common. They want to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty of the national independence of the United States. George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Richard Myers all have something in common. They worked for secret societies that are front organizations for the whore of Rome. They all worked for the Vatican. That they have in common. The Black Pope, ma'am, is the head of the Jesuit order. He is the supreme military commander of the Jesuits. Yes, ma'am. These three men, George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Richard Myers, were the only ones who could have given the order to let the planes do their deeds of destruction. These men were American leaders working for the Vatican and perpetrating the murders of thousands of American citizens who trusted them. Are we awake? You know, I've had people on the internet who have denounced me and my books because they say, Hughes is just an absolute fool because he thinks that leaders in our world are under Rome's control. Well, you know, I always tell people, opinions are like noses. Everybody's got one. Well, you know, folks, when it comes to opinions, the final authority is the yardstick of Scripture. And the Bible makes it crystal clear who's working with the kings of the earth today. Revelation 17, 1 and 2 and 18 says, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. And this great whore, Revelation 17, 5 says, is Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, which is in absolute rebellion against the authority of God. And verse 2 says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So Revelation 17:2 says that the kings of the earth are in unlawful connection with Babylon the Great. Now, all the reformers were clear on who Babylon the Great was, and who is Babylon the Great? The papacy. The papacy. And the Bible says that the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And who are the kings of the earth? The leaders, the presidents, the dictators, the kings, the emperors. You know, that verse gives the impression that they're on equal ground, even ground, that the whore and the kings are equal partners. But Revelation 17:18 makes it a little bit clearer. The Bible says, the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. When you reign over somebody, does that mean you're equal to them? No. You dominate them. You tell them exactly what to do. It's like if I were riding on a horse and I've got the reins. The horse is my slave. The horse does what I tell him to do. Just as the rulers of this world do what the papacy tells them to do. Revelation 18:24 says, and in her, the papacy, was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. You know, 3,000 people died in this massacre on September 11, 2001. The Bible says that Babylon the Great is responsible for the blood that's shed upon this earth. I think that would fit very clearly into the context of Revelation 18:24. Working for Rome. How else do you explain this? Critics find it incredible. The hijackings were unanticipated occurrences. As claimed, with one of the hijacked airplanes having already completed its terrorist mission, the country was suffering the worst terrorist attack of its history. And yet the commander-in-chief, rather than making sure that his military was prepared to shoot down all hijacked planes, sticks to his planned schedule. At 8:48, the first pictures of the burning World Trade Center were broadcast on live television. By that time, the FAA, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the Military Command Center, the Pentagon, the White House, Secret Service, and Canada's Strategic Command all knew that 3 commercial airplanes had been hijacked. And why at 9:03, 15 minutes after it was clear that the United States was under terrorist attack, did President Bush sit down with a classroom of second graders and begin a 20-minute pre-planned photo op? I don't know how many of you play the stock market, how many of you invest your money in that, but they have something in the stock market. It's called put options. Usually when you invest in a stock, you do it with the idea that if you invest in it, as the stock goes up, you make money. But there's also a stock called a put option, and that is where you can invest in a company with the idea that it's going to go down. And if the company's stock goes down, your stock goes up. That's called a put option. Well, just before September 11th, there was an extremely high volume of put options that were purchased for the stock of Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, which had 22 stories of the World Trade Center, and there was a tremendous amount for United and American Airlines, the 2 airlines used in the attacks. Now, the reason that we know that is because there were intelligence agencies that monitor the stock market, and they watch for clues of impending catastrophe. And they noticed an extremely high volume of put options purchased on these businesses. It says the level of these trades was up by 1,200% in the 3 days prior to the attacks. When the stock, if a single group of speculators purchased most of the thousands of put options on those 3 stocks, this group would have made over $10 million. This unusual set of purchases raises suspicions that investors had advanced knowledge of the strikes. That's from David Ray Griffin's book, The New Pearl Harbor, page 71 and 72. Again, for somebody as a Seventh-day Adventist to look at Bible prophecy, or anybody interested in Bible prophecy, after the World Trade Center assault, the new Patriot Act passed. The bill is amazing. It was passed just 6 weeks after the trade centers went down. Usually it takes a bill months to pass through Congress, but they'd already had the bill written before the tragedy occurred. The bill enhances the ability of federal agents to tap phones, share intelligence information, track internet usage, emails, cell phones, and protect U.S. borders. A lot of people were concerned in America. I picked up a newspaper November 26, 2001 in Loma Linda, California. Had a picture of 2 children decorating a Christmas tree. One was up at the top singing, "He sees you when you're sleeping, He knows when you're awake." The child at the bottom, the caption was, "Stop talking about Attorney General Ashcroft like that." Our liberties, folk in America, are being destroyed. Destroyed. And the Patriot Act has had a tremendous influence in doing that. Bible said, take heed that no man deceive you. Revelation 13:12 says that America, the lamb-like beast, would exercise all the power of the papacy before him, and would cause the earth and them which dwell therein to honor the tradition of Rome, whose deadly wound was healed, to worship the first beast. Down at the end of time, a world power would compel the world to honor the Sunday tradition of Rome. How they would do it remained for the people at the end of time to decipher. God has given us warning after warning. Are we listening? You know, folk, the papacy today and the Jesuit order that control the media of the world, the television, the newspapers, the magazines, control the wealthy of the world. Revelation 18:11-15 tells us, controls the churches of the world. Revelation 17:5. The papacy is desperate today to deceive the world into believing that the great antichrist power in the world today is Islam. And the words of Jesus tumble down 20 centuries. Take heed that no man deceive you.